You don't belong on that bench, you uppity." Detective Marcus Johnson's words cut through Courtroom 8B like a blade, but before he could finish the slur, his fist was already flying toward Judge Sarah Washington's face. The punch connected with devastating force, sending the 52-year-old federal judge crashing backward into her chair. But Johnson wasn't finished. His boot followed immediately, kicking her in the ribs with enough violence to crack bone. The sound echoed through the marble courthouse like thunder. What Johnson didn't know was that Judge Washington wasn't just any judge. She was the sister of Devon Brown, the teenager Johnson had executed 3 years ago and covered up. This wasn't random court assignment. This was justice 15 years in the making, and the FBI agents sitting in the gallery. They'd been waiting for exactly this moment, because Johnson's assault was about to trigger the largest police corruption bust in federal history. If you believe no one should be above the law, type justice below. Judge Sarah Washington pulled herself upright, blood trickling from her split lip, but her dark eyes blazed with something Johnson couldn't recognize: anticipation. For 3 years, she had been waiting for this moment, building her case piece by piece, knowing that eventually Johnson's arrogance would destroy him. "Detective Johnson," she said, her voice steady despite the pain, "you just assaulted a federal judge in front of 12 FBI agents, but more importantly, you just confessed to murdering my little brother." Johnson's face went white as chalk. The confident swagger that had carried him into the courtroom evaporated instantly, replaced by the wild-eyed panic of a predator who suddenly realized he had walked into a trap. "Your brother. I don't know what game you're playing, but Devon Brown was my baby brother, 16 years old when you shot him in the back and called it self-defense. And now you're going to pay for every lie you told, every report you falsified, every family you destroyed." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs as the pieces clicked into place. This wasn't about Riley Williams's arrest for aggressive eye contact. This was about systematic murder, cover-ups, and a sister's 3-year quest for justice that had been disguised as routine court proceedings. Riley Williams, the 15-year-old honor student sitting in the front row with her mother Patricia, suddenly understood why her case had been assigned to this particular judge. Her mother's grip tightened on her hand as they processed the magnitude of what they were witnessing, the culmination of a federal investigation that had been years in the making. Agent Maria Torres rose from her seat in the gallery, her credentials already visible. She had been disguised as a civilian observer throughout the hearing, but now her true identity was revealed with surgical precision. "Detective Marcus Johnson, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, human trafficking, and assault on a federal judicial officer." Johnson's hand instinctively moved toward his service weapon, but Agent Torres's voice cut through his desperation with professional authority. "I wouldn't recommend that, Detective. We have 17 federal agents positioned throughout this building, and your backup isn't coming because they're all being arrested simultaneously." The truth hit Johnson like a sledgehammer to the chest. His radio calls hadn't been answered because his entire precinct was being raided at that exact moment. Captain Robert Davis and Lieutenant Kevin Miller were already in federal custody, their offices being searched while evidence of their conspiracy was documented by forensic teams with military precision. Judge Washington opened a thick manila folder that had been sitting conspicuously on her bench throughout the entire hearing. "Detective Johnson, this folder contains evidence that will destroy not just your career, but your freedom for the rest of your natural life. Audio recordings, financial documents, witness testimony, and video evidence of crimes you thought were buried forever." Johnson's earlier bravado was crumbling like a house of cards as he realized the scope of what he was facing. His voice cracked with desperation. "This is all fabricated. You can't prove anything. This is a setup." "Actually, we can prove everything, including the fact that you and your partners were operating a human trafficking ring, using your police authority to target vulnerable teenagers for sale to private correctional facilities." The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Riley Williams felt her mother's protective grip tighten as they processed the horror of what they were learning. This wasn't just about police brutality or racist violence. It was about organized crime using badges as cover for the most heinous offenses imaginable. Agent Torres stepped forward, her professional demeanor masking years of careful planning and investigation. "Detective Johnson, We've been monitoring your activities for 8 months. Every conversation, every transaction, every crime you thought you committed in secret, we have it all documented with federal-grade surveillance equipment. Johnson's desperation was becoming palpable, sweat beading on his forehead despite the courtroom's cool temperature. You're lying. You can't have been watching me for 8 months without me knowing. I would have detected surveillance. Judge Washington smiled with the cold satisfaction of someone who had orchestrated every detail of this moment. You're absolutely right, Detective. We've actually been watching you for 3 years, ever since you murdered my brother. The 8-month intensive surveillance was just the final phase of building our prosecutorial case. She pulled out another document, this one bearing official FBI letterhead and classification stamps that made Johnson's remaining color drain completely. This is a federal wiretap authorization, signed by a federal judge in Washington, D.C. Every phone call you made, every text message you sent, every conversation you had with your co-conspirators, all of it was being recorded and analyzed by federal investigators. Judge Washington reached into her evidence folder and withdrew a plastic bag containing something that made Johnson's blood freeze in his veins, a second police badge with a name that sent him into psychological free fall. Detective Kevin Pierce's badge, Judge Washington announced to the stunned courtroom, holding the evidence bag high enough for everyone to see. Your partner in the trafficking operation. The one who was selling children to private correctional facilities while you eliminated the ones who fought back or posed threats to your criminal enterprise. Johnson's voice cracked like breaking glass. That's impossible. Pierce died in a car accident 2 months ago. You can't have his badge because he was buried with it. Pierce was murdered by your other partner when he tried to expose the operation and cooperate with federal investigators. And before he died, he gave me everything. Names, dates, bank accounts, video evidence of you executing children who refused to be trafficked, and detailed records of your financial arrangements with private prison contractors. The revelation sent another wave of shock through the courtroom. Riley Williams felt her mother's protective embrace tighten as they processed the systematic nature of the crimes being revealed. This wasn't just about individual acts of violence. It was about an organized criminal enterprise that had been operating under law enforcement cover. Agent Torres stepped forward with additional evidence materials. Detective Johnson, we've been monitoring your activities through a joint task force involving the FBI, DEA, and federal marshals. Every phone call you made, every meeting you attended, every transaction you completed, all of it was being documented by federal investigators. Johnson looked around the courtroom wildly, searching for escape routes that didn't exist. Court security officers had positioned themselves at every exit, while additional federal agents were filtering in through the main doors with the practiced efficiency of a military operation. His world was closing in with mathematical precision. The beauty of our operation, Judge Washington continued, consulting her notes with deliberate slowness, is that you never suspected a thing. You thought you were untouchable because you had local administrative protection. You never imagined that federal authorities might be interested in your systematic violations of civil rights and interstate trafficking violations. Agent Torres activated a device that caused the courtroom's monitors to spring to life with crystal-clear surveillance footage. What you're about to see, Detective Johnson, is video from your meeting with Raymond Castellanos of Riverside Youth Corrections 3 weeks ago. The meeting where you discussed payment schedules for trafficking minors to his private facility. The screen filled with devastating video of Johnson sitting across from a man in an expensive suit, cash-changing hands, while they discussed the delivery of troubled teenagers to private facilities with the casual efficiency of businessmen negotiating commodity prices. Johnson's own voice came through the speakers with chilling clarity. The brown kid was causing too many problems with his questions about missing friends. Had to eliminate him before he started talking to social workers or community advocates. Johnson's legs seemed to give out as he heard his own confession played back to him with perfect audio quality. The casual way he discussed murdering a 16-year-old boy revealed the depth of his sociopathy and the systematic nature of his crimes against vulnerable youth. "This can't be happening," Johnson whispered, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "You people set me up. This whole thing was an elaborate trap designed to destroy my career and reputation." Judge Washington's voice carried the weight of 3 years of meticulous planning. Detective Johnson, the only person who set you up was yourself. Every crime was your choice. Every victim was someone you decided to hurt for profit. And now you're going to face the consequences you thought would never come. The weight of institutional corruption hung over the courtroom like a toxic cloud as Agent Torres wheeled in additional evidence carts. Detective Johnson, we also have financial records showing payments totaling over $400,000 that you received from private correctional facilities, bail bond companies, and juvenile transportation services. Johnson's hands were shaking violently now, as the financial scope of his criminal enterprise was revealed. He hadn't just been a racist cop. He had been running a sophisticated trafficking operation that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars while destroying young lives for profit. Judge Washington felt the satisfaction of justice finally arriving after 3 years of careful investigation and planning. Her brother's murder had been the catalyst for exposing crimes that extended far beyond a single corrupt officer. It had revealed a network of systematic exploitation that had been operating with impunity. "Detective Johnson," she announced with quiet authority, "you're about to face federal charges that include the death penalty, human trafficking of minors, murder in furtherance of a criminal enterprise, and conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law." As Johnson processed the magnitude of his situation, Agent Torres coordinated with her team through subtle hand signals that indicated the operation was expanding beyond anything he could have imagined. Agent Torres gestured to her team, and the courtroom filled with the sound of additional evidence being wheeled in on federal evidence carts. Dozens of boxes containing documents, computer hard drives, and recording equipment that represented months of coordinated federal investigation across multiple jurisdictions. "Detective Johnson," Judge Washington said, consulting another thick file with meticulous attention to detail, "let's discuss your relationship with Captain Robert Davis and the systematic training program you developed for targeting minority youth for trafficking purposes." Johnson's face had gone ashen as he realized the full scope of the federal case building against him in real time. Captain Davis was just following standard department policy. "We were trying to clean up dangerous neighborhoods and protect law-abiding citizens from criminal elements." "Really? Then perhaps you can explain this audio recording from last month's training session where you instructed 47 officers from 3 different precincts." The courtroom speakers crackled to life with Johnson's voice, addressing a group of rookie officers with the confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable. "The key to effective policing in minority communities is establishing dominance early and maintaining it through consistent enforcement. These kids need to understand that questioning authority has consequences, sometimes permanent consequences that serve as examples for others." A collective gasp arose from the gallery as the recording continued, with Johnson describing specific techniques for provoking confrontations with black teenagers, detailed methods for justifying excessive force in official reports, and sophisticated strategies for intimidating families who might seek accountability through legal or political channels. Riley Williams felt physically sick as she listened to Johnson casually discussing the systematic terrorization of young people who looked like her. Her mother, Patricia, held her closer while fighting back tears of rage at the casual cruelty being revealed through Johnson's own recorded words. Judge Washington allowed the recording to play for several more devastating minutes, documenting Johnson's systematic approach to training other officers in techniques that violated every principle of constitutional policing and human dignity. That training session was attended by 47 officers from 3 different precincts, Judge Washington announced when the recording ended. 17 of those officers are currently being arrested as we speak, based on evidence of their participation in your criminal conspiracy. Johnson's desperation reached new heights as he realized the scope of the federal operation. "This is all taken out of context. Officers have to be prepared for dangerous situations. We were discussing hypothetical scenarios for training purposes. Detective Johnson, what context makes it acceptable to train officers to murder children for refusing to cooperate with trafficking operations?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud, leaving Johnson without any response, because there was no acceptable context for what he had been teaching, the systematic dehumanization and elimination of black youth under the pretense of law enforcement training. Agent Torres approached the evidence table and selected a laptop computer with federal evidence tags. What we're about to show you is even more damning. Financial records showing payments totaling over $400,000 that you received from private prison companies, bail bond businesses, and juvenile transportation services in exchange for generating arrests and delivering specific categories of children. The laptop screen was mirrored to the courtroom monitors, displaying bank statements, wire transfer records, and detailed contracts that revealed the financial incentives driving Johnson's systematic crimes. He hadn't just been a racist cop operating on personal prejudice. He had been running a sophisticated criminal enterprise that profited from destroying young lives. Each arrest you made in minority communities generated an average of $1,200 in payments from these private companies, Judge Washington explained with clinical precision. Devin Brown's murder wasn't just about racism. It was about eliminating a witness who could have exposed your trafficking operation to federal authorities. Johnson's hands were shaking uncontrollably now, as the mathematical precision of his greed was laid bare for everyone to see. He had been literally selling children into private correctional systems, while murdering those who refused to cooperate or who posed threats to his profitable operation. The federal government has seized all of your assets under civil forfeiture laws, Agent Torres announced, with professional satisfaction. Your bank accounts, your house, your vehicles, your retirement funds, and your life insurance policies, all of it is being forfeited as proceeds from criminal activity. Johnson looked around the courtroom with wild, desperate eyes, perhaps only now understanding that his life as he had known it was completely over. Everything he had built through systematic crime was being stripped away while the evidence of his corruption was displayed for the world to witness. Judge Washington felt a cold satisfaction as she watched Johnson's psychological collapse accelerate. For 3 years, she had been building this moment, using her position in the federal judiciary to coordinate with law enforcement agencies while maintaining the careful appearance of routine case assignments. "Detective Johnson," she said with quiet finality, "you murdered my brother because he witnessed you forcing children into unmarked vehicles for transport to private facilities. You thought killing him would protect your operation. Instead, it started the federal investigation that will destroy you and everyone who helped you." The courtroom door opened with deliberate timing to admit a figure that made Johnson's remaining color drain completely from his face. Reverend Thomas Wilson, the community leader who had been organizing protests against police brutality for the past 2 years, and who Johnson had considered a useful source of information about problem families. Johnson stared in absolute disbelief, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "Reverend Wilson, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be at the community meeting." Judge Washington smiled with grim satisfaction that had been building for months. "Detective Johnson, meet our primary undercover informant. Reverend Wilson has been working with federal authorities for over a year, documenting your activities and recording your conversations while pretending to cooperate with your targeting of community families." The revelation hit Johnson like a physical assault. Reverend Wilson, the man he had considered a useful collaborator who helped him identify troublemakers in the community, had actually been gathering evidence of his crimes for federal investigators while wearing sophisticated recording equipment. Reverend Wilson approached the witness stand with the quiet dignity of someone who had spent months living an incredibly dangerous double life. His every interaction with Johnson had been carefully planned and monitored by federal agents who understood the risks of infiltrating a criminal organization protected by law enforcement authority. "Detective Johnson," Reverend Wilson said with steady authority, "every conversation we had about problem children was recorded with federal-grade equipment. Every name you gave me, every family you targeted, every threat you made against community members, the FBI has it all documented with timestamps and audio enhancement." Johnson's voice cracked with desperate betrayal. "You betrayed your own community. I was trying to help clean up those neighborhoods and protect law-abiding families from criminal elements. You were murdering children and selling others into slavery," Reverend Wilson replied, with the quiet authority of someone who had witnessed unspeakable evil. "I couldn't stand by and watch you destroy more families while hiding behind a badge and community trust. Agent Torres activated another sophisticated recording device, and Johnson's voice filled the courtroom with chilling clarity and devastating specificity. "That Williams girl needs to be dealt with before she starts causing trouble like her cousin did last year. Maybe arrange for her to have an accident during transport to the juvenile facility." Riley Williams felt her mother's protective arms tighten around her as they heard Johnson casually discussing her potential murder with the same tone he might use to discuss weather conditions. The teenager he was planning to eliminate was sitting right there in the courtroom, listening to her would-be killer reveal his murderous intentions. Judge Washington allowed the recording to continue for several more devastating minutes, documenting Johnson's systematic approach to eliminating witnesses and potential threats to his trafficking operation. His methods included staging accidents, provoking confrontations that would justify deadly force, and coordinating with corrupt officers in neighboring jurisdictions. Reverend Wilson wore federal surveillance equipment to 37 meetings with you over the past year, Judge Washington explained with clinical precision. Each conversation provided additional evidence of your criminal conspiracy and your specific plans to harm identified children in the community. Johnson's psychological breakdown was accelerating as he realized that his most trusted community contact had been systematically documenting his crimes for federal authorities. Every confidence he had shared, every plan he had revealed, every moment of criminal vulnerability had been preserved for prosecution. "This is impossible," Johnson whispered, his voice barely audible above the courtroom's ventilation system. "You can't have recorded everything." "There were private conversations in secure locations, meetings in my patrol car. We recorded everything," Reverend Wilson said with simple finality, "including your detailed confession about murdering Devon Brown because he witnessed you loading children into an unmarked van for transport to private correctional facilities." The community leader's words hit the courtroom like thunder. Johnson hadn't just murdered Devon Brown in a moment of racist rage. He had executed him specifically to protect a systematic child trafficking operation that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal profits. Agent Torres consulted her tablet and announced with professional satisfaction, "Based on Reverend Wilson's recordings and supporting surveillance evidence, we have identified 43 children who were trafficked through Detective Johnson's operation over the past 4 years. 17 of those children are still missing and presumed to be held at various private facilities." The magnitude of Johnson's crimes was becoming clear to everyone in the courtroom. This wasn't just about police brutality or racist violence. It was about organized crime on a scale that defied comprehension. He had been using his badge to kidnap children for profit, while murdering those who resisted or posed threats to his systematic operation. Judge Washington felt the weight of justice finally arriving after 3 years of careful planning and coordination with federal authorities. Her brother's murder had been the catalyst for exposing crimes that extended far beyond a single racist cop. It had revealed a network of corruption that had been systematically destroying families for years. Agent Torres wheeled forward a specialized evidence cart containing dozens of file boxes, labeled with federal seizure notices and evidence tags that represented the financial backbone of Johnson's criminal enterprise. "Detective Johnson, these boxes contain financial records spanning the past 5 years of your systematic trafficking operation." She opened the first box with practiced efficiency and removed a stack of bank statements that had been highlighted and annotated by federal forensic accountants. "Your primary checking account received deposits totaling $437,000 from private correctional facilities, bail bond companies, and juvenile transportation services." Johnson watched in growing horror as the precise financial details of his crimes were displayed on the courtroom monitors with devastating clarity. Every payment had been tracked, analyzed, and connected to specific victims who had been trafficked through his operation or eliminated when they posed threats to his criminal enterprise. Each deposit corresponds to a child who was delivered to private facilities or eliminated when delivery proved impossible, Judge Washington explained, consulting a detailed spreadsheet that made Johnson's face cycle through expressions of shock and terror. "Devon Brown's name appears on this list as a planned delivery before you murdered him for attempting to escape and expose your operation. The financial records revealed the truly systematic nature of Johnson's criminal enterprise. He hadn't been randomly targeting minority youth based solely on racial prejudice. He had been fulfilling specific contracts with private companies that paid premium rates for troubled teenagers who could be exploited for labor or kept in custody for extended periods. Agent Torres pulled out another document with official corporate letterhead. This contract with Riverside Youth Corrections shows that you were being paid $1,200 for each high-risk juvenile you delivered to their facility. The contract specifically requests African American males between 14 and 17 years old with behavioral issues. Johnson's voice was barely audible above the courtroom's air circulation system. Those contracts were for legitimate transfers of dangerous criminals to appropriate correctional facilities. Detective Johnson, the children on this list include honor students, community volunteers, and teenagers whose only crime was existing while black in your patrol area and refusing to show the immediate submission you demanded. Riley Williams felt physically nauseated as she realized how close she had come to becoming one of the names on that systematically organized list. Johnson's arrest of her for aggressive eye contact had been the first step in a carefully planned process that would have resulted in her disappearance into the private prison system. Judge Washington opened another evidence folder containing photographs that made Johnson visibly recoil with recognition and terror. These are federal surveillance photographs of you delivering children to private facilities. The FBI has been watching your operation for months, documenting every transaction with professional-grade equipment. The photographs showed Johnson in his police uniform, escorting handcuffed teenagers into unmarked vans while men in civilian clothes waited with cash payments in predetermined amounts. The images were time-stamped and geotagged, providing irrefutable proof of his systematic trafficking activities. Your operation generated an average of $18,000 per month in illegal income, Agent Torres announced with clinical precision. All of those assets are being forfeited to the federal government and will be used to provide restitution to your victims' families and fund expanded child protection services. Johnson's carefully constructed financial empire was collapsing in real time as federal agents seized bank accounts, real estate, and personal property that represented years of criminal profits. The luxury lifestyle he had built on the systematic suffering of children was being methodically dismantled by federal asset forfeiture procedures. Judge Washington consulted her notes and announced, "Detective Johnson, we've also identified payments you made to other officers for their cooperation in your trafficking operation. Captain Davis received $67,000. Lieutenant Miller received $41,000. Officer Jennifer Torres received $28,000 for administrative support." The scope of the financial corruption was staggering, even to experienced federal investigators. Johnson hadn't been operating as a lone criminal. He had systematically corrupted multiple officers and created a network of paid accomplices who helped him kidnap children while providing administrative protection for his crimes. Each of those officers is facing federal charges based on the financial evidence alone, Agent Torres explained, with professional satisfaction. But we also have detailed audio recordings of them discussing the operation and planning specific trafficking events. Patricia Williams asked the question that was haunting every parent in the courtroom. "Your Honor, how many children were actually trafficked through this operation?" Judge Washington consulted federal investigative reports before responding. "Based on financial records and surveillance evidence, we believe Detective Johnson's network trafficked at least 43 children over the past 4 years. 17 of those children are still missing, and federal recovery teams are working to locate them. The magnitude of the systematic child trafficking was overwhelming to process. Johnson had been operating a criminal enterprise that destroyed dozens of families, while generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in profits for himself and his corrupt accomplices." Judge Washington activated a sophisticated federal recording device that caused Johnson's face to contort with absolute terror as he recognized the implications of what was about to be revealed. "What you're about to hear, Detective Johnson, is your recorded conversation with Captain Davis from 6 weeks ago, discussing the planned trafficking of Riley Williams." The courtroom speakers came alive with Johnson's voice, speaking with the casual confidence of someone who believed he was completely protected from consequences. The Williams girl is absolutely perfect for our private facility contracts. Young, intelligent, no serious family support system. On a student background, we can pick her up on any minor excuse and have her transferred within 24 hours. Riley Williams felt her mother's protective embrace tighten as they heard Johnson casually discussing her kidnapping and sale to private correctional facilities with the same tone he might use to discuss livestock transactions. The teenager he was planning to traffic was sitting right there in the courtroom, listening to her potential destroyer reveal his systematic intentions. Captain Davis's voice responded through the speakers with equal casual cruelty. "What about the family? The mother seems like she might cause administrative problems if the girl disappears into the system." Johnson's recorded laughter was chilling in its complete absence of human empathy. That's exactly what happened to the Brown family when they started asking too many questions about their son's disappearance. Sometimes administrative problems solve themselves permanently, if you know what I mean. The casual way Johnson discussed murdering families who sought accountability revealed the true scope of his sociopathy and systematic approach to eliminating threats to his criminal enterprise. He hadn't just been trafficking children, he had been willing to eliminate entire families to protect his profitable operation. Judge Washington allowed the recording to continue for several more devastating minutes, documenting Johnson's systematic approach to identifying, kidnapping, and trafficking vulnerable youth while coordinating with corrupt officials to avoid detection and eliminate potential witnesses. This recording was made in Captain Davis's office, which has been under continuous federal surveillance for 8 months, Agent Torres explained with professional precision. "We have over 40 hours of conversations documenting your trafficking operation, financial arrangements, and elimination protocols." Johnson's psychological collapse was accelerating as he heard his own words describing the most heinous crimes imaginable with the casual efficiency of someone discussing routine business operations. His systematic discussion of child trafficking and family murder revealed a level of evil that shocked even experienced federal investigators. "Detective Johnson," Judge Washington said with quiet authority, "this recording also includes your detailed confession about murdering Devon Brown to prevent him from exposing your systematic trafficking operation to federal authorities." Johnson's recorded voice continued through the speakers with devastating clarity. "The Brown kid saw too much when we were loading the transport van with other teenagers. Had to eliminate him permanently before he could start identifying our private contractors or describing our selection methods to social workers." The courtroom listened in horrified silence as Johnson described executing a 16-year-old boy specifically to protect his child trafficking operation. His matter-of-fact tone revealed the complete absence of conscience that had enabled his systematic destruction of young lives for financial profit. Reverend Wilson had tears streaming down his face as he listened to Johnson casually discussing the murder of a child he had known since birth. Devon Brown had been an active member of his congregation, a young man with dreams of becoming a teacher who had been eliminated specifically to protect criminal profits. Judge Washington felt the weight of 3 years of investigation and planning, culminating in this moment of absolute revelation. Every piece of evidence, every recording, every document had been carefully assembled to ensure that justice would finally be served for her murdered brother and the dozens of other children who had suffered at Johnson's hands. "Detective Johnson," she announced with the authority of federal law, "based on this recording alone, you face federal charges of conspiracy to commit murder, human trafficking of minors, and violations of civil rights under color of law. Each charge carries a potential death penalty under federal statutes." Johnson's remaining psychological composure finally shattered completely under the weight of his exposed crimes. "This is all fabricated evidence. You manufactured this conspiracy to destroy my reputation and career. No jury will believe this elaborate setup." Agent Torres stepped forward with federal marshals flanking her position in practiced formation. "Detective Marcus Johnson, you are under arrest for violations of federal civil rights laws, systematic human trafficking, murder in furtherance of a criminal enterprise, and assault on a federal judicial officer." As federal marshals moved to place Johnson in custody, Judge Washington raised her hand to indicate there was one final revelation that would complete the destruction of his criminal network and ensure that every accomplice faced appropriate federal prosecution. Comment your country and city. Let's see where accountability is being demanded. As federal marshals prepared to arrest Johnson, Judge Washington raised her hand with deliberate timing to stop them. There's one more revelation that Detective Johnson needs to hear before he's taken into federal custody for processing. She opened a final evidence folder and withdrew a high-resolution photograph that made Johnson's face cycle through expressions of shock, terror, and desperate psychological calculation. The image showed him meeting with a man in an expensive suit outside a private correctional facility. Detective Johnson, meet your primary business partner, Raymond Castellanos, CEO of Riverside Youth Corrections. The man who's been paying you hundreds of thousands of dollars to deliver children for systematic exploitation in his private facilities. Johnson stared at the photograph with wild, desperate eyes. Castellanos has absolutely nothing to do with this investigation. He runs a completely legitimate correctional facility that provides necessary services to the juvenile justice system. Mr. Castellanos was arrested this morning at his corporate headquarters by federal agents, Agent Torres announced with professional satisfaction. He's currently cooperating fully with federal investigators and has provided detailed information about your trafficking operation in exchange for consideration during sentencing. The revelation hit Johnson like a devastating physical blow. His primary business partner had been arrested and was already providing comprehensive testimony against him. The man who had been paying him hundreds of thousands of dollars for trafficking children was now working systematically to destroy him in exchange for a reduced federal sentence. Judge Washington consulted another comprehensive document. According to Mr. Castellanos' detailed testimony, you delivered 43 children to his facility over the past 4 years. Many of those children were subsequently subjected to forced labor, systematic physical abuse, and psychological torture designed to break their resistance to exploitation. The true horror of Johnson's crimes was becoming crystal clear to everyone in the courtroom. He hadn't just been kidnapping children for financial profit. He had been delivering them to facilities where they were systematically abused and exploited by private contractors who specialized in profiting from their suffering. Castellanos has also provided detailed financial records showing additional payments you received for delivering children with specific characteristics that commanded premium prices, Agent Torres explained while consulting federal investigation reports. Younger children commanded significantly higher payments. Children without strong family support systems were specifically preferred. Children with academic potential were especially valuable for certain experimental programs. Johnson's trafficking operation had been far more sophisticated and systematically evil than anyone had initially imagined. He had been essentially running a specialized catalog service for private facilities that wanted to exploit specific types of children for different purposes and research projects. Riley Williams felt physically ill as she processed the full implications of what she was hearing. Johnson hadn't just arrested her for aggressive eye contact. He had been carefully evaluating her potential value to private facilities that specialized in exploiting intelligent young people for psychological research and behavioral modification experiments. Judge Washington pulled out another federal recording device with official evidence tags. Detective Johnson, this is your recorded conversation with Mr. Castellanos from 3 months ago, discussing Riley Williams' potential value to his systematic exploitation operation. Johnson's voice filled the courtroom with terrifying clarity and casual cruelty. The Williams girl is exactly what your clients have been requesting. Intelligent, articulate, strong family background, no serious behavioral problems. She'd be absolutely perfect for your educational exploitation program and psychological research initiatives. Castellanos' voice responded with equal casual evil. Excellent. Our private clients pay premium rates for subjects who can be used in long-term psychological research projects. How quickly can you arrange delivery without attracting family attention? The casual way these monsters discussed Riley's potential systematic exploitation revealed the truly organized nature of their criminal enterprise. They weren't just trafficking children randomly. They were carefully matching specific victims to clients who had particular interests in exploiting them for research and profit. Patricia Williams held her daughter closer as they heard these predators discussing her, as if she were merchandise to be evaluated and sold to the highest bidder. The teenager sitting beside her had come within days of disappearing into a systematic exploitation network designed to destroy young minds for scientific profit. Mr. Castellanos has provided us with comprehensive client lists showing the ultimate destinations for children you trafficked over the years, Judge Washington announced with clinical precision. Some were used for systematic forced labor. Others were subjected to unauthorized medical experiments. Many simply disappeared into facilities where they could be exploited indefinitely without oversight. Johnson's face had gone completely white as the full scope of his systematic crimes was revealed in devastating detail. He hadn't just been a corrupt cop operating on personal prejudice. He had been facilitating the most heinous forms of organized child exploitation imaginable while generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in criminal profits. The weight of systematic evil hung over the courtroom as everyone processed the magnitude of crimes that had been operating under law enforcement protection. Federal marshals stepped forward with practiced precision as Agent Torres formally read Johnson his constitutional rights. Marcus Johnson, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit human trafficking, murder in furtherance of a criminal enterprise, systematic violation of civil rights under color of law, and assault on a federal judicial officer. Johnson's legs seemed to give out completely as the full weight of his situation became undeniably clear. The federal charges he was facing carried potential death penalties, and the evidence against him was overwhelming in its scope and precision. His life, as he had known it, was completely and irrevocably over. You have the right to remain silent, Agent Torres continued with professional authority. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you by the federal court system. As the handcuffs clicked around Johnson's wrists with metallic finality, Judge Washington felt a satisfaction that had been building for 3 years finally reach its culmination. The man who had murdered her brother Devon and trafficked dozens of other children was finally facing the consequences of his systematic crimes. But more than personal vindication, this moment represented the triumph of justice over institutional corruption that had protected predators while destroying innocent families. Detective Johnson, she said as federal marshals prepared to escort him from the courtroom, my brother Devon was 16 years old when you executed him. He had dreams of becoming a teacher, helping children learn and grow, making a positive difference in his community. You destroyed those dreams to protect your criminal operation and financial profits. Johnson turned back toward her with eyes full of desperate rage and the kind of hatred that had driven his crimes for years. This isn't over. You think you've won? But there are others. This network is bigger than you know. More officers, more facilities, more people who will never let this stand. His words confirmed what federal investigators had suspected throughout their investigation. Johnson's trafficking operation was part of a larger criminal enterprise that extended beyond Riverside County and involved corruption in multiple states. His arrest would be the beginning of a wider investigation that would ultimately expose systematic child exploitation across regional jurisdictions. Agent Torres coordinated with her team through subtle hand signals as Johnson was escorted from the courtroom. Judge Washington, we have federal teams standing by to execute additional warrants based on evidence gathered during today's proceedings. Detective Johnson's confessions have provided probable cause for searches and arrests across 3 states. The operation's scope was expanding in real time as Johnson's detailed confessions and the evidence revealed during the hearing provided federal authorities with the legal foundation for dismantling an entire network of corruption. His trafficking operation was being systematically destroyed while he was led away in federal custody. Riley Williams watched Johnson's departure with a complex mixture of relief and horror. The man who had planned to traffic her into systematic exploitation was finally facing consequences, but the knowledge of how close she had come to disappearing forever would stay with her for the rest of her life. Her simple refusal to look away from his intimidation had ultimately triggered the exposure of crimes that defied comprehension. Judge Washington addressed the courtroom with the authority that came from years of planning this moment. Let the record show that Detective Marcus Johnson has been taken into federal custody pending trial on charges that carry potential death penalties. This court will remain in session to coordinate with federal authorities as additional evidence is processed and additional arrests are executed. Patricia Williams held her daughter tightly as they processed what they had witnessed. Their family's encounter with Johnson had been far more than police harassment. It had been their near destruction by a criminal enterprise that had been operating under the protection of law enforcement authority for years. Reverend Wilson approached the bench with tears still visible in his eyes. Judge Washington, I want to thank you for having the courage to expose this systematic evil. The community will never forget what you've done to protect our children from predators who used badges as cover for the most heinous crimes imaginable. The community leader's words carried the weight of families who had lost children to Johnson's trafficking operation and others who had been saved by the federal investigation that was still expanding. His willingness to work undercover for months, wearing federal surveillance equipment and risking his life, had provided crucial evidence that made the prosecutions possible. Agent Torres received continuous updates through her earpiece as federal teams across multiple jurisdictions executed coordinated arrests. Judge Washington, we're receiving reports of successful arrests from teams in neighboring counties. Captain Davis was apprehended at the airport, attempting to flee the country, with evidence suggesting he was planning to escape to a non-extradition jurisdiction. The coordination of the federal operation was impressive in its scope and precision. While Johnson was being processed for federal detention, dozens of other officers and civilian accomplices were being systematically arrested based on evidence gathered during months of investigation and the confessions revealed during the hearing. Lieutenant Miller has been taken into custody at his residence, another voice reported through Torres's communication system. Federal agents discovered additional evidence suggesting the trafficking operation extended to neighboring states and involved coordination with private facilities across regional boundaries. Judge Washington felt deep satisfaction knowing that the entire network that had protected and enabled Johnson's crimes was being dismantled with mathematical precision. The systematic corruption that had allowed child trafficking to flourish under law enforcement protection was finally being exposed and prosecuted at the federal level. Riley Williams processed the information with growing amazement at the scope of what her simple act of courage had triggered. Her arrest for aggressive eye contact had led to the exposure of a criminal enterprise that had been destroying families across multiple states. Her refusal to be intimidated by Johnson's demands for submission had ultimately resulted in his complete downfall and the rescue of children who were still being exploited. Agent Torres announced to the courtroom with professional satisfaction, "We are currently executing federal warrants for 17 additional officers, 4 civilian contractors, and 3 private facility administrators across multiple jurisdictions." The total scope of this criminal enterprise appears to involve over 50 individuals operating across state lines. The magnitude of the systematic corruption was staggering even to experienced federal investigators. Johnson hadn't been operating as an isolated criminal. He had been part of a sophisticated network that included dozens of accomplices who had helped him traffic children while providing administrative and legal protection for his crimes. Patricia Williams asked the question that was haunting every parent in the courtroom. "Your Honor, what happens to the children who are still missing? Will federal authorities be able to find them and bring them home safely?" Agent Torres stepped forward to address Patricia Williams's crucial question about the missing children, while simultaneously coordinating the expanding federal operation through her communication devices. "Mrs. Williams, we have specialized child recovery teams working with federal marshals to locate and rescue the 17 children who remain missing from Detective Johnson's trafficking operation." Her words carried the weight of a federal commitment that extended far beyond prosecuting criminals to actually rescuing victims who were still suffering in the facilities where Johnson had delivered them for systematic exploitation. Each child who could be recovered and returned to their families would represent a victory against the organized evil he had perpetrated. The courtroom's atmosphere was electric, with the energy of justice finally being served after years of systematic abuse that had operated with complete impunity. Judge Washington felt the satisfaction of watching institutional accountability finally triumph over the corruption that had protected predators while destroying innocent families. Agent Torres received an urgent communication through her earpiece that caused her expression to brighten significantly with what appeared to be excellent news. Judge Washington, I have an important update. Our recovery teams have successfully located and rescued 12 of the 17 missing children from facilities in 3 different states. The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause and tears as families who had been searching for missing children finally received hope that their loved ones would be returned safely. The federal operation was achieving its most important objective, rescuing victims from continued exploitation and abuse. The children are currently receiving comprehensive medical attention and psychological support from federal specialists, Agent Torres continued with professional satisfaction. They will be reunited with their families as soon as medical professionals determine they are physically and emotionally ready for the transition home. Judge Washington felt emotions threatening to overwhelm her professional composure as she processed the magnitude of what had been accomplished through 3 years of careful planning and investigation. Her quest for justice for Devon had resulted in the rescue of children who were still alive and suffering in the facilities where Johnson had trafficked them for profit. Reverend Wilson stood and addressed the courtroom with the authority of someone who had witnessed the community's pain firsthand. This is what happens when good people refuse to remain silent in the face of systematic evil. Detective Johnson thought his badge made him untouchable, but he underestimated the power of coordinated resistance. Riley Williams asked the question that was on everyone's mind. What about the other 5 children who haven't been found yet? Will federal authorities be able to locate them before they suffer more abuse? Agent Torres consulted her tablet before responding with careful optimism. We have strong leads on the remaining 5 children based on intelligence gathered from the facilities we've already searched. Additional coordinated raids are being planned for facilities in neighboring states where we believe they may be held. The federal investigation was expanding exponentially as each facility that was raided provided evidence pointing to additional locations where children were being systematically exploited. Johnson's trafficking network was being unraveled piece by piece while victims were rescued and perpetrators were arrested across multiple jurisdictions. Patricia Williams stood and addressed Judge Washington directly with gratitude that carried the weight of a mother who understood how close her family had come to complete destruction. Your Honor, I want to thank you for protecting my daughter and for fighting for justice when it would have been easier and safer to remain silent about institutional corruption. Her words carried the appreciation of a parent who recognized that Riley's arrest had been the first step in a systematic process that would have resulted in her disappearance into facilities specifically designed to exploit intelligent children for research and profit. Judge Washington responded with emotion clearly evident in her voice, despite her professional composure. Mrs. Williams, your daughter's courage in refusing to be intimidated by Detective Johnson's demands for submission was the catalyst for exposing this entire criminal network. Her strength and dignity helped save other children from suffering the same fate that destroyed my brother. Riley Williams had become an unlikely hero whose simple refusal to look away from Johnson's intimidation tactics had ultimately led to his complete downfall and the rescue of dozens of other children who had been systematically exploited. Her basic act of maintaining eye contact and refusing to submit had triggered a federal investigation that dismantled an entire criminal enterprise. Agent Torres provided another crucial update. We've also arrested Raymond Castellanos' business associates who were operating similar facilities in neighboring states. The financial evidence suggests this trafficking network generated over $2 million annually through the systematic exploitation of vulnerable children. The scope of the criminal enterprise was staggering in its systematic organization and financial sophistication. Johnson hadn't been operating a simple corruption scheme. He had been part of a multi-state network that generated millions of dollars through the organized trafficking and exploitation of children. Reverend Wilson announced with the authority of someone who had coordinated community resistance. The community, is organizing comprehensive support services for all the families who have been affected by this criminal network. We will ensure that every child who was victimized receives the specialized help they need to heal and rebuild their lives. The community response demonstrated the power of collective action in supporting victims and preventing future crimes through coordinated accountability measures. The exposure of Johnson's systematic network had galvanized residents to work together in protecting their children and holding law enforcement accountable for their actions. Agent Torres provided a final update that would determine Johnson's ultimate fate. Detective Johnson will be transported to federal detention pending trial. Based on the evidence gathered today and the scope of his criminal enterprise, federal prosecutors will be seeking the death penalty for his systematic crimes against children. Judge Washington felt a profound sense of completion as Agent Torres coordinated the final phases of the child recovery operation that had been the ultimate goal of her 3-year investigation. The rescue of children who were still being exploited in Johnson's network represented the true victory over the systematic evil he had perpetrated under law enforcement protection. The 12 children we've successfully recovered are receiving specialized care from federal victim services, Agent Torres announced with visible satisfaction. Each child will have access to comprehensive medical treatment, psychological counseling, and legal advocacy to help them rebuild their lives after systematic trauma. The federal commitment to victim recovery extended far beyond simply prosecuting criminals to actually providing the long-term support necessary for healing from the kind of systematic abuse Johnson's network had inflicted. Each rescued child would receive whatever resources were necessary to overcome their exploitation and reclaim their futures. Riley Williams asked the question that reflected her growing understanding of the situation's complexity. Will the children who were rescued be able to testify against Johnson and his accomplices, or would that cause them more trauma? Agent Torres addressed the concern with professional sensitivity. Federal prosecutors will work closely with victim advocates and psychological specialists to determine what level of participation would be appropriate for each child. Their healing and well-being will always take priority over prosecutorial considerations. The federal approach to victim rights demonstrated a commitment to treating rescued children as survivors, rather than simply evidence in criminal cases. Their recovery and long-term well-being would be supported regardless of their ability or willingness to participate in legal proceedings against their exploiters. Judge Washington consulted updates from federal recovery teams. I'm receiving reports that the 5 remaining children have been located at facilities in neighboring states. Federal teams are coordinating with local authorities to execute rescue operations within the next few hours. The precision and coordination of the federal response demonstrated the resources that were being devoted to dismantling Johnson's network completely, while ensuring that every victim was recovered and provided with appropriate support services. Patricia Williams addressed a concern that was troubling many parents in the courtroom. Your Honor, how can families protect their children from this kind of systematic targeting? What warning signs should parents watch for? Agent Torres stepped forward to provide practical guidance. We're working with community leaders and school districts to develop educational programs that will help families recognize signs of systematic targeting and understand their rights when encountering law enforcement. The federal commitment extended beyond prosecuting past crimes to actively preventing future victimization through community education and empowerment. Families would be equipped with the knowledge and resources necessary to protect their children from systematic exploitation. Reverend Wilson announced community initiatives that were already being implemented. We're establishing a community watch network that will document all police interactions with youth and provide immediate legal support for families who experience concerning encounters with law enforcement. The community response demonstrated how Johnson's exposure had galvanized residents to create systematic accountability measures that would prevent future abuse while supporting families who encountered problems with police officers. Judge Washington received another update that brought visible relief to her expression. Federal teams have successfully rescued all 5 remaining children. Every child who was trafficked through Johnson's operation has now been located and is receiving appropriate care. The complete success of the child recovery operation represented the ultimate vindication of the 3-year investigation that had begun with Devon's murder. Every victim of Johnson's systematic crimes was now safe and receiving the support necessary for healing and recovery. Agent Torres provided details about the broader impact of the investigation. The evidence gathered during this operation has provided federal authorities with the information necessary to investigate similar networks in 12 other states. Johnson's arrest appears to have triggered the exposure of a national trafficking enterprise. The scope of systematic child exploitation was larger than anyone had imagined, but Johnson's downfall was providing federal authorities with the evidence necessary to dismantle organized networks that had been operating with impunity across multiple jurisdictions. Riley Williams reflected on the magnitude of what her simple act of courage had accomplished. "I can't believe that refusing to look away from Detective Johnson led to rescuing so many children and exposing crimes across multiple states." Her observation captured the fundamental lesson of the entire investigation, that individual acts of courage and resistance could trigger systematic change when supported by dedicated professionals who refused to accept institutional corruption as inevitable. Judge Washington addressed the courtroom with the authority that came from successfully completing one of the most complex civil rights investigations in federal history. This case demonstrates that justice is possible when good people refuse to remain silent about systematic abuse, even when that abuse is protected by institutional authority. Patricia Williams asked about long-term accountability measures. What safeguards are being put in place to prevent this kind of systematic corruption from operating again? Agent Torres outlined comprehensive reforms. Federal oversight of the police department will continue for a minimum of 5 years, with civilian accountability boards, mandatory body cameras, and community oversight of all interactions with youth. The institutional changes would ensure that the systematic corruption that had enabled Johnson's crimes would be replaced with transparency and accountability measures that prioritized community safety over officer protection. Reverend Wilson concluded with words that captured the community's determination. Detective Johnson thought his badge made him untouchable, but he learned that no one is above accountability when communities refuse to accept systematic abuse as normal. 6 months after the dramatic confrontation in Courtroom 8B, the federal prosecutions were delivering justice with surgical precision that sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities nationwide. Detective Marcus Johnson had been convicted on 17 federal charges and sentenced to death by lethal injection, the judge specifically noting that his assault on Judge Washington demonstrated an absolute rejection of the rule of law and constitutional government. The federal court's decision to impose the death penalty reflected the systematic nature of Johnson's crimes and their impact on dozens of families whose children had been trafficked, exploited, or murdered. His trafficking operation had generated over $2 million in criminal profits while destroying young lives across multiple states. Captain Robert Davis received a federal sentence of 45 years without possibility of parole for conspiracy and civil rights violations, while Lieutenant Kevin Miller was sentenced to 30 years for his role in covering up murders and intimidating witnesses who tried to seek accountability through official channels. The sentences sent unprecedented shockwaves through law enforcement communities across the country, serving notice that systematic racism and institutional corruption would no longer be protected by administrative indifference or professional courtesy among officers. Grace Brown, Devon's mother, had become the primary spokesperson for the federal civil rights case, her dignity and persistent demands for justice inspiring similar families across the country to come forward with their own stories of police abuse and systematic targeting. Standing outside the federal courthouse after Johnson's sentencing, she spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had transformed personal tragedy into systematic change that would protect future generations. "My son Devon was murdered by a man who thought black children's lives were worthless and could be eliminated for profit. But his death was not meaningless if it prevents other mothers from experiencing this pain." The federal investigation had ultimately identified 47 families whose children had been victimized by Johnson's network, each receiving substantial financial settlements, but more importantly, official acknowledgement that their children had been wronged by the system that was supposed to protect them. Riley Williams, now 16 and thriving in her junior year of high school, had become a nationally recognized advocate for police reform and youth rights. Her experience in Judge Washington's courtroom had taught her that speaking truth to power was not just possible, but essential for creating systematic change. "I used to be afraid of police officers," Riley said during a speech at a national youth leadership conference. "Now I understand that good officers want the same thing we do: safe communities, where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. The bad officers were afraid of us because they knew we could expose their lies and systematic crimes." Her transformation from potential victim to national advocate demonstrated the resilience of young people who refused to be broken by systematic intimidation and abuse. Judge Sarah Washington had declined multiple offers to join higher federal courts, choosing instead to remain in criminal court, where she could continue protecting vulnerable youth from systematic abuse and institutional corruption. Her chambers had become a model for judicial activism, with judges from across the country seeking her guidance on identifying and confronting institutional racism in their own courtrooms and jurisdictions. The Riverside County Police Department underwent complete restructuring under federal oversight, with new leadership, revised training protocols that emphasized constitutional rights, and community accountability measures that served as a template for departments nationwide. Body camera policies were comprehensively revised to prevent the kind of technical difficulties that had allowed Johnson's crimes to be covered up for years. All recordings were automatically uploaded to federal servers that couldn't be accessed or modified by local administrators. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural: the widespread recognition that silence in the face of systematic injustice was no longer acceptable, that good people had a moral obligation to speak truth to power, regardless of personal cost or professional convenience. Jennifer Wilson, the court administrator who had preserved crucial evidence that destroyed Johnson's network, was promoted to Director of Federal Court Security and became a national expert on protecting judicial proceedings from corrupt law enforcement. Her courage in exposing Johnson's systematic crimes had prevented dozens of other families from experiencing the Brown family's tragedy, while demonstrating that institutional change was possible when individuals refused to accept corruption as inevitable. The memorial garden planted outside the courthouse in Devon Brown's memory had become a gathering place for families who had lost children to police violence, a space where grief could be shared and hope could be nurtured through collective action. Grace Brown tended the roses planted in her son's honor, finding peace in the knowledge that his death had catalyzed changes that would protect future generations from the systematic exploitation that had destroyed so many families. Detective Lisa Chen, the internal affairs officer whose secret recordings had provided crucial evidence for federal prosecutors, was appointed as the first civilian director of police accountability, with authority to investigate misconduct complaints without interference from police administration. Her appointment marked a fundamental shift in how police departments would be held accountable for their officers' actions, with civilian oversight replacing the internal protection systems that had enabled systematic corruption. The ripple effects of Johnson's exposure extended far beyond Riverside County, inspiring federal investigations in 12 other states and leading to the conviction of over 300 corrupt officers who had been operating with similar impunity. The systematic approach to accountability had created a national movement that refused to accept police violence as inevitable or normal. 2 years after the assault that echoed through the halls of justice and triggered the largest police corruption investigation in federal history, Judge Sarah Washington received an unexpected visitor in her chambers. Grace Brown knocked softly on the door, carrying a small wrapped package and wearing the peaceful expression of someone who had found closure after years of grief and determined struggle for accountability. "Judge Washington," Grace said, settling into the chair across from the desk with quiet dignity, "I wanted to thank you personally for having the courage to stand up when it mattered most. Devon's death finally has meaning because you refused to let Johnson hide behind his badge and institutional protection." The package contained a framed photograph of Devon Brown at his high school graduation smiling with the bright optimism of a young man who believed the future held unlimited possibilities for growth and contribution to his community. Beneath the photo was an engraved plaque reading, "Justice delayed is not justice denied, when good people decide to speak truth to power." Judge Washington felt tears gathering in her eyes as she studied Devon's face, seeing in his expression the same dignity and hope that she had witnessed in countless young people who had appeared in her courtroom seeking protection from a system that too often failed them systematically. The Johnson case had become a watershed moment in American civil rights history, studied in law schools and police academies as a comprehensive example of how institutional racism operates and how it can be dismantled through persistent courage and meticulous documentation. Judge Washington's refusal to be intimidated by Johnson's violence had demonstrated that the rule of law could prevail over the rule of force when good people refused to remain silent about systematic abuse and corruption. The federal consent decree governing the Riverside County Police Department had become a model for police reform nationwide, with comprehensive provisions requiring implicit bias training, community oversight, and transparent investigation of misconduct complaints. Crime rates in formerly over-policed neighborhoods had actually decreased significantly, as community trust in law enforcement was rebuilt through genuine accountability and mutual respect rather than intimidation and systematic targeting. Most importantly, young people in Johnson's former patrol area no longer lived in constant fear of police encounters. The systematic terrorization of black youth had ended completely, replaced by community policing models that emphasized protection rather than intimidation and exploitation. The transformation was visible in the confident way teenagers now interacted with police officers, asking questions about their rights and expecting respectful treatment rather than immediate submission to avoid violence or arrest on fabricated charges. Riley Williams had graduated as valedictorian of her high school class, earning a full scholarship to study criminal justice at Howard University with the goal of becoming a federal prosecutor specializing in civil rights cases. In her graduation speech, she spoke about the day in Courtroom 8B that had changed her understanding of power, justice, and the responsibility that comes with refusing to accept systematic abuse as normal or inevitable. "I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear," Riley said to the packed auditorium, filled with families who had been transformed by the Johnson investigation. "Courage is doing what's right, even when you're terrified of the consequences. Judge Washington showed me that one person willing to stand up can change everything." The scholarship fund established in Devon Brown's memory had provided educational opportunities for over 200 young people who had been victimized by police misconduct, transforming systematic trauma into opportunity and ensuring that Johnson's victims could build the futures he had tried to destroy. Judge Washington kept Devon's photograph on her desk as a daily reminder that justice work required both professional competence and personal courage that extended beyond career advancement or personal safety. Every case that came before her bench was an opportunity to either perpetuate systematic failures or create space for healing and accountability that could prevent future victimization of vulnerable people. The courthouse steps where Grace Brown had once stood alone, demanding justice for her murdered son while facing institutional indifference, now hosted regular community meetings where residents worked directly with police officials to build trust and prevent the kind of corruption that had flourished in darkness and silence. As evening fell over the courthouse where so much healing had begun, Judge Washington prepared to leave for home, where her husband waited with dinner and stories of his own day saving lives as a trauma surgeon. The physical mark from Johnson's assault had long since faded, but the memory of that moment when she chose dignity over retaliation, when she let Johnson's violence expose itself rather than meeting it with violence of her own, remained as vivid and meaningful as ever. Johnson himself was serving his time on federal death row, his days spent in isolation, away from the general population that included many of the young men whose lives he had destroyed through false arrests and systematic targeting for trafficking. His name had become synonymous with police corruption and systematic abuse, a cautionary tale taught to every new recruit about what happened when officers forgot their oath to serve and protect all citizens equally. But Judge Washington's legacy was fundamentally different. Her name was spoken with reverence in communities that had learned to trust the justice system again, in law schools where students studied her techniques for confronting institutional racism, and in courtrooms where other judges found courage to challenge corruption rather than enabling it through silence. The lesson was simple but transformative. Sometimes the most powerful response to systematic hatred is simply refusing to be broken by it, standing firm until truth wins, and choosing to stay where the work matters most rather than seeking personal advancement or safety. Some battles are won not through force, but through the quiet courage of refusing to step away, when stepping away would be easier and safer for everyone involved. Thank you to everyone who typed justice and shared your locations. Seeing accountability being demanded everywhere proves this movement is unstoppable.